What if I told you some of football's greatest triumphs have been built on financial quicksand? Champions Leagues, Europa Leagues, Premier Leagues, all of these trophies have been won by teams that have gone through, or come close to going through, the biggest nightmare for a football club, going bust. And one of the most iconic stories for this is Parma. Well, to put it simply, their story is the ultimate rise and fall epic in football history. Picture this, a small, regional but historic Italian club languishing in obscurity until 1986, when a financial crisis threatens to wipe them out. But then, salvation comes in the form of Parmalat, a dairy empire that acts as a powerful financial lever for the club. What followed was nothing short of a miracle. Between 1990 and 2002, Parma enjoyed their most successful period. Gianluigi Buffon, Fabio Cannavaro, Hernan Crespo, Juan Sebastian Veron, Hristo Stoichkov, Lilian Thuram, 6 players who played for Parma during this period. Yes, some of them, like the Bulgarian, were at the end of their careers, and others, like Buffon and Crespo, were just starting out. But all of them went down in history in some way before or after their time at Parma. Ballon d'Or, Champions League, World Cup level of stars. This was the pinnacle of Parma's history. During this historic decade, Parma won 8 major trophies, including 3 Coppa Italia, 2 UEFA Cups, a Supercoppa Italiana, and a UEFA Super Cup. It was all looking fabulous, and the fans were already looking forward to a deep run in the Champions League, the only place where Parma still hadn't proved themselves. But then, it all fell apart. In 2003, the Parmalat empire collapsed under the weight of one of the biggest fraud scandals in corporate history and the biggest bankruptcy in European history. The company lost a staggering 14 billion euros in 2003, and that figure has still not been surpassed by any European company in the last 21 years. As a result, Parma were declared bankrupt and remained in special administration for 3 years. And although the club continued to exist on paper, the damage had already been done. Just over a decade later, Parma had completely collapsed, with no funds to run basic matchday operations, let alone pay the wages of their players. The second time Parma were forced into bankruptcy, they were relegated in Serie D. Yes, they escaped the complete nightmare of dissolution by returning to Serie A 3 years later, but they are unlikely to return to their glory days anytime soon. What do you think? Another club who suffered a similar fate, but went a step further in misery, was Russian giants Anzhi Makhachkala. If you've never heard of this team, this is because Anzhi no longer exist. And when I say similar fate, I really mean it because they followed a very similar path to Parma. They invested heavily in attracting star players, but the difference was that most of those men were well past their prime, such as Roberto Carlos and Samuel Eto'o. Yes, one of the most iconic fullbacks and strikers of the last 25 years actually travelled to the wind and snow of Russia to play for Anzhi. Well, that team was the Al Hilal and Al Nassr long before Saudi clubs were even a thing, and at the end of the day, if you can't buy it with money, you can certainly buy it with a lot of money. And that was the philosophy of owner Suleiman Kerimov. He invested heavily, even making Eto'o the highest paid footballer in the world at one point. But all that glittered wasn't gold, and it was evident that this strategy wouldn't work out for a very long time. I mean, how long would you be able to pay astronomical wages to a man who had just won a treble with Inter Milan? So by 2013, Kerimov's interest had waned, and so had his willingness to finance the club's expenses. Yes, Anzhi continued to exist for the next 9 years, mostly in the lower leagues, but by 2022, the club had disappeared from the footballing maps. Now imagine this, a club so financially broken that its future is hanging by a thread. And we're not talking about any club, but a certain Chelsea. The London Giants we now associate with Premier Leagues, Champions League, and huge financial power were circling the drain in the early 1980s. At the time, Chelsea were in shambles, burdened by debt, a crumbling Stamford Bridge, and not winning the league for 28 years. Yes, this was the period when Chelsea was literally on the brink of dissolution. But in 1982, the legendary Ken Bates stepped in, confident in his ideas and the only one brave enough to listen to his intuition to try and turn things around, taking over the club for £1. Yes, that's right, £1. His tenure was marked by risky decisions and even a few controversies, but he had one big priority in mind: to save the club and only then to secure Stamford Bridge as Chelsea's home, and finally to renovate it. And he did it all. He's the man responsible for making Stamford Bridge look the way it does today. He was also successful on the pitch, bringing in the likes of Ruud Gullit and Gianfranco Zola. By the time Roman Abramovich arrived in 2003, Chelsea had regained their relevance and were poised for the next era of dominance. Now let's head south for our next two destinations. First, Deportivo La Coruña. How can we describe the success of this iconic club in the early 2000s in one word? Well, that would probably be phenomenon. Nicknamed Super Depor, La Coruña defined all expectations and were dubbed the Giant Slayer. There was simply no better team in Spain during Deportivo's golden years. The highlight came in 2000 when Deportivo stunned the world by winning La Liga, leaving Barcelona, Valencia and Real Madrid far behind. Bebeto and Roy Mackay were two of the big players to play for Depor in that legendary period between 1995 and 2005. After that, they did quite well until the end of the decade, but the real decline began in the 2010s. Deportivo fell into debt, were relegated several times, and by 2020 were languishing in the third tier of Spanish football. Their case, however, was not as harsh as that of Parma, Anzhi, or the next club on the list. Chievo Verona. Yes, until recently, they were one of those famous clubs that ceased to exist because of their finances. However, in May 2024, after more than 3 years out of business, the owners of the Serie D side, Clivents, successfully auctioned off the logo and naming rights of the original Chievo Verona club. And technically Chievo do exist, but in a different form. But how did they get into this difficult situation? Well, Chievo have never been the most successful of clubs, but they've always shown guts and solidity, even against the big boys. They made their Serie A debut in 2001, and for years, the Flying Donkeys were a force to be reckoned with, punching well above their weight and regularly securing mid-table finishes. Behind the scenes, however, things weren't quite so smooth. The club relied heavily on clever management and player sales to balance the books, but as revenues fell and competition increased, cracks began to appear. In 2018, they were deducted points for financial irregularities, which was the beginning of the end. And then, in 2021, Chievo were declared bankrupt, unable even to meet the registration requirements for Serie B, which led to their expulsion from the Italian football pyramid. Chievo may have returned in one form or another, but a certain Ukrainian club hasn't, and that's a shame, because a little less than a decade ago, they were on the verge of achieving something historic. Europa League final, 2014-15, semi-finals. One of Italy's most successful clubs, Napoli, up against a complete outsider, Ukrainian side FC Dnipro. Yes, they had never reached this stage before, yet they defied the odds, knocking Napoli out of the tournament and qualifying for their first European final, just months after winning their first league title in the club's 107-year history. Against them were the heavyweights of the Europa League, Sevilla, led by Unai Emery. Well, Dnipro were twice ahead in the game, but in the end it was the Spanish club who emerged victorious, leaving Dnipro with a bitter taste in their mouths, but with the hope that next time they would get over the line. Unfortunately, that next time never came. The mixture of mismanagement, poor finances, and of course, the conflicts in eastern Ukraine took their toll. By 2018, Dnipro had been declared bankrupt and were forced to start again in the amateur leagues. There have been a few attempts to reignite the flame, much like Chievo. Dnipro 1 was the club that took over the infrastructure of the original FC Dnipro, but withdrew from professional football this summer in July 2024. For Rangers, however, the idea of bankruptcy once seemed unthinkable. With a record 55 league titles to their name, Rangers had dominated Scottish football for decades, but their success on the pitch couldn't protect them from financial disaster. The club's problems began long before they hit rock bottom in 2012. Years of overspending on players and unsustainable financial practices accumulated debts that the club simply couldn't repay. Despite their rich history and loyal fan base, Rangers went into administration in February 2012. When no solution was found, the unthinkable happened. The club was liquidated and reorganised into a new structure, similar to what happened to Dnipro, Chievo and Parma. Rangers were forced to start again in the fourth tier of local football. Yes, at first it was a shock to the fans, but they never abandoned them, and that proved vital to their rapid rise. By 2016, Rangers had regained their place in the Scottish Premiership, and 5 years later they were back in the title race, winning it in 2021. This allowed them to play in the Europa League, where they famously reached the final, but like another team we talked about, Dnipro, they lost to Sevilla. Yes, it's safe to say that if you play in the Europa League, sooner or later, Sevilla always come knocking on your door. We have two questions for you. Firstly, what is the biggest bankruptcy story in world football history? And secondly, do you think Barcelona could also go down some of the same roads with their tight finances? Let us know below. And if you made it this far, why don't you give us a try with another one of our videos you see on your screen right now. Until next time.